Hey guys, it's Mendy from Rising Tide Consulting Group. I wanted to take a moment to do some videos on Rewst, which is a robotic process automation platform. The idea being is that if you have a business process that's being run manually, you could translate that into an automation workflow, and then that workflow can run automatically, saving you time from having to run that process manually. So this is Rewst. That's their goal is to replace all business processes that are manual with an automated workflow, either collecting data or reconciling that data or posting that data or whatever it is that needs to happen. The idea being with automation in general that if you can abstract out enough, then you can make it automated. Even if you can't abstract the specific parts of the flow of the process, if it's the same process you're doing over and over again, then you can again automate that too. So the goal of this video again is supposed to be a quick intro, a few minutes, maybe 10, maybe 5, I don't know, we'll see how long we go, but just to show you around the UI, the interface, and how to use the platform. We're not going to go into building a workflow. We're not going to go into too many specifics. This is a high-level overview of the Rewst platform. So on my screen, you should be able to see the dashboard of the Rewst platform. We're going to come back to that. And we're actually going to do something a little different. We're going to start from the bottom of the menu. Instead of going down, we're going to start from the bottom and work our way up. Okay. So the very first option, or very last option that we see, is the settings area. And the settings area is where you would go to manage the users, assign them roles, kick them out, whatever. Create your user invites, okay? Manage the organizations that exist within your Rewst tenant. You cannot create organizations from here yet. You can just edit them, edit their retention. You can modify their tags, change the name, but you don't have the ability to add organizations right now. And then modify or create tags. So you see I created a demo test tag. You can change the color. Clicking into the color area without editing it will allow you to modify the color. You can add the tag description and then choose your color after. So that's the settings area. The next area we want to go into is the tools. The tools literally right now just has the Jinja Live editor. If you know Jinja, if you're familiar with Jinja, if you've worked with Ansible, great, you have a leg up. If you are not familiar with Jinja or you know of it, but you don't really know it, it's not hard. There's just a lot to learn. But the most important thing to know is that it's not required. The idea behind Rewst and other similar systems is that it is a low-code or no-code platform, and it's not low-code or no-code. It's either or. Some of it, either there's no code in some places, or there's a little bit of code you have to do. Low-code, no-code just happens to be the name. So it is a low-code, no-code platform built on visual workflow design. So you don't have to know Jinja. If you do want to do stuff on your own, you want to get a little bit more advanced, you want to do Jinja, Rewst has something called the Robotic Operations Center, like the Security Operations Center, the SOC. They have a ROC, Robotic Operations Center, and they will provide assistance on, creating or helping you identify like how to do a specific task or things like that within the platform. It's one of the huge value adds that come with Rewst is the ROC, that they have a bunch of talented people on that team. So that's tools. There's just a Jinja Live editor. Most of the time, you won't even access it through here. We'll go into that a little bit more later. The next thing that we have is configuration. Configuration includes where you set your organization variables. These are variables that are created in a global area that then get referenced across workflows. You can have variables within workflows, 100%, but this is for a situation. Remember, I said we want to think about abstract. This is a situation where you need to assign a value, and you don't want to have to make it in every single workflow. So you just create a variable that's global, and then you can reference it in every workflow. You don't have to recreate it every time. The variables do have the ability to be assigned to an organizational context. So the workflow has the ability to run under an organization's context, and when it's running under that context, that variable may or may not exist for that organization context, or even if it does exist and it's a different value for that organization context, then this is where you would go set that context for this variable. One of the other settings here about this that I'm going to point out is use as default, this checkbox right here. If you set this checkbox, that means that what will happen is that if you have an organization that doesn't have this variable created, it will refer back to the default variable to grab the value. If it's not checked and the organization does not have this variable exists, then the value will be null or won't return because the variable doesn't exist. If it's set to default, then it'll just read the default value of the variable across organizations that do not have that variable currently defined. So that's organization variables. Integrations is exactly what it sounds like. These are all the things that the platform connects to. So remember I said this is like low code, no code. You literally pick an integration, you configure it, and you test it and you map your orgs. And then that's it. All the capabilities behind the API that have been programmed in by Rewst are suddenly available to you within a workflow. So these are the integrations that I have active. And I think that we can even actually just click on, so I'm going to open up the Halo PSA integration. I'm not actually going to set it up. I'm just going to back out and let's see. Yep, it's been added into my platform. And I'm going to hit the Hoodoo documentation. And again, I'm not going to set it up right now. I'm just going to get back out so we can have some of that. And then I will add in the Microsoft graph. And I'm going to get back out. And last but not least, I'm going to add in a Microsoft Exchange Online. Okay. So now I got a bunch of integrations that are quote unquote active. They're not actually active. They're not set up, but they do exist within my instance. And we'll just keep going. This is where you would go to set that up, and you would test it and save it, and then it would be working essentially. The next area going, again, we're working our way up. So the next area we're going to talk about is crates. Crates are basically a packaged up combination of various different elements from Rewst. So Rewst has the ability to have workflows, it has forms, it's got templates, it's got scripts. And the crate is like a packaged up. It's all those things packaged up into a single solution, and it's placed in the marketplace. And it's pushed into a marketplace that we can then go and say, hey, I want that automation. So I'm going to click on it. So like, hey, alert when user's mailbox are reaching quota. Boom. I want to create an alert when a user mailbox hits 90% or even 80% or maybe 85%. And instead of creating a ticket, I'm just going to contact the user via that ticket. So that way it creates a ticket and also emails the user automatically. That's going to say, hey, your mailbox is 85% full, time to clean it up. Or I'll just create the ticket. I will create the ticket. Looks like I ran into a little UI bug. And that way it's the technician will know to go back and say, hey, it's time to it'll reach out to the user and curate that relationship in order to make sure that the mailbox is taken care of. So this is the trigger that actually runs, and you go through and you configure the crate. You can tell what organizations to activate for, or activate for this one, activate for the following tags, right? This is what you would use tags for. And these are the integrations that would be used during when installing the crate. Again, we're going too far into this. I said we weren't going to go this far in. That's what crates are essentially. And you'd go through and configure it. It would walk you through configuring it. So let's move on to the automations and notice that this is where most of the stuff is, right? You've got like 4 things here, just as many things as you do outside of it, you have inside of it. So automations are where it's all at. Scripts are where we would create a script that gets used in more than one place, right? So think about how the variables would work. Scripts are going to be the same thing. If you want to have a script that can be referenced in more than one workflow, you absolutely can manually, I say manually, but in reality, I mean like singularly, write up a script and place it into a workflow. But then if you wanted to use that script in a different workflow, you'd have to go in, copy that script, paste it into the second workflow, and keep going. Whereas here, if you put the scripts, like, the first time you need to use a script in more than one workflow, grab it out of that workflow, throw it into here, and then update that workflow to use the templated script. And then every future workflow, just use the templated script. So you don't have to recreate the script every single time. Another thing that may help explain it is think about function scripts. We're building a function, and then we're calling that function each time we want it. Python is, sorry, not Python, Jinja. Jinja is supported within the script. So if you can do write host, if you know, and then we can do, right. So we're doing a Jinja string theoretically, but we can do something to actually make it look like real Jinja. And it would basically come out as PowerShell saying write host hello world. I'm mixing PowerShell and Jinja together. It does work. So you can template your script using Jinja templating language and actually use it later on. There are other languages that exist here that you can just save and have it reuse, and so on and so forth. So that's scripts. In templates, we have the similar idea, except that in this case, it's not a script, it's a text block. And the format that gets displayed in is either going to be Markdown or HTML. So if it's Markdown, you can see render it as, right? So it's Markdown, and you can see it rendering as you type. HTML would be slightly different. You would be using actual real HTML tags, right? And notice it's indenting automatically. And again, we are going way back into, right? And it's also pre-filling in your completions. So let me just do this one more time and show you. Notice that it's got my HTML pre-filled. I'm just going to auto-complete that HTML. Does it for you. So you can build out the document. Essentially, it's building a document. You can template stuff out as well. Jinja is supported in here. So you can do and then it'll complete and come out as this is a title with Jinja, essentially. And then you can use that it's a functionized document. You can use it in more than one workflow. So that's what templates are. Scripts are very similar, just scripts is an actual script. Template is a document. Forms are going to be where you go to create a form to collect data. So everyone's like, oh, you can't automate a business process because it needs to collect data. Well, guess what? You can collect data by creating a form. And then you build the form that you want. Or here's a description. Here is a drop-down list of choices you can select. Here is a drop-down list of multiple selections you can pick. There are radio buttons, text input, so you can collect text data, multi-line input, and so on and so forth. You can literally build out a form to collect the data that's needed, and then that form fires off automation. Okay. One of the most important things I'm going to talk about regarding the forms is going to be how it passes that data into the workflow. So we'll talk about that very briefly. Again, I'm going to try to keep it high level, and we'll see it in action later on in another video. So right now, you notice the placeholder label for the dropdowns. You've got placeholder 1, value 1, placeholder 2, value 2. You have option label and option value. Okay. You also have at the top a field label and a field name. Notice the label is much more user-friendly than the name. And if you go through and look at the text input, it's got a name, text input. If you get a placeholder label, it's got a name as well. So the way it works is each of those names will get passed into the workflow. The value of the field will be the value of the value of the name that gets passed into the workflow. That's confusing. Let me try again. Wow. Let's pull up a notepad real quick. Give me 1 second and let's bring this on screen. This is essential to know, so I want to cover this very briefly. You have a field called placeholder label, or yeah, a field where it looks like it's called placeholder label, but the field name is multi-line input. In any kind of programming, the way it works is you have something called a key pair object. Okay, so if you have a key pair object, that means you have a key or key value object or key value pair or something like that. You have a key. The key is going to be the name of the reference name. In this case, we're just going to call it name. And then the value is going to be the value of that object, of that item. So the key is the name of the item, and then the value is the value of that key, essentially. So if I say the name is Mendy, I'm describing myself, a person, right? So I can be, okay, this is a person, and the name of that person is Mendy, right? And I can say something like company. So the company of that person is Rising Tide. And I'm building out essentially a mapping, right? Or a dictionary of describing an object of some kind. And inside that dictionary, we have a key. The key is the way to find a value, and we have the value. So I'm looking for person.name will come back as Mendy. Person.company will come back as Rising Tide. Okay. If that makes sense, let's go back to this. The name that we're talking about is multi-line input. The value of what we see. So the workflow is going to receive, right? So going into the workflow, we're going to have a multi-line input. And then the value is going to be based off what's inside of the actual text area. So like the stuff you actually put in here, like typing in here, is going to be what gets passed in. Okay. Alternatively, if you don't require it to be changed, you can set a default value. And then the default value gets passed in, or they can change it. Whatever the value, whatever is filled into the text box becomes the value of that key. Okay. I can't say that enough. The next most important thing about that is that when you're dealing with a dropdown, the value that gets set is actually the option value, not the option label. It is the same exact idea, concept, but it's just another level down. Okay, so if we notice, I'm going to go ahead and preview that form again. If we drop down, we've got placeholder 1, 2, and 3. I'm selecting placeholder 2, but I'm looking at the key, not the value. The value that gets passed through the label is placeholder 2 or placeholder 1. The value that gets passed into the actual workflow is value 1. Okay, just keep that in mind. It's going to come back important. If you only slightly understand it, we're going to go into it again later on. It's not a big deal. It's just important to understand that going in for everything else. So just keep that in mind. And again, like I said, we will re-review that in the future. So let me close this out and let's keep going. That is forms. Forms are you take the controls, you drop them onto the forms, and then you can configure the forms to do what you want. When you click submit, the form will fire a workflow, perform an automation. Okay. Workflows themselves. I have a test workflow here. We'll make another one. Test workflow 2. And I'll show you around the interface of workflows. Again, our goal is not to create an actually working workflow right now. The goal is to get you familiar with the Rewst interface and that to finish this video in a time that's not too long to watch in one sitting. So the interface is pretty straightforward. You've got on the side, the left-hand side, the different integrations that existed. You might recognize them from the configuration area. And if you expand any of these integrations, you'll see all the available actions that you can do against that integration. So the core integration has a bunch of stuff built in. The Exchange Online has invoke command. The graph has a lot more. Rewst has some built in as well. Not only that, you also have the ability to fire off other workflows from within the workflow. So you can fire it off, you can take the data it came back with, you can mess with it, you can do other automations, you can essentially have ongoing recursiveness of automation so that however complex or convoluted your business process is or needs to get, in order for us to automate it, you can do it. It's just a matter of how far you can abstract or how creative you can twist things around, or if we can take a manual process that takes an hour to run and we can complete 50% of it and cut off an hour, make an hour 30 minutes, then that's still 30 minutes saved. And as you get over time and you understand how things are and you get used to the automation, you may think of new creative ways to get rid of the last 50% or automate that part too. So it's really like the platform was built for customization, for recursion, for automation, for abstraction, in order to replace, like I said, the core value, the goal, the mission here is for Rewst to come in and say, you have a business process that you're manually running. Let's get rid of that. And instead of you wasting your time on manual reconciliations and double checking, like we can do all that stuff. Computers are really good at correlation. We can do all of that stuff automatically. You just have to tell us what to do one time. It may take slightly longer than it would to do it yourself, but you tell us what to do one time, and then we will just do it every single time, saving you money. So that's the idea of the workflow framework. Now let's start building something out, and I'll show you around the actual thing. The first trick I'm going to tell you is that the workflows generally need a starting task. So all these things we're talking about, these are called tasks within the workflow, okay? As I use the terminology, I'm going to tell you about it. So we need to set a starting task, because without a starting task, there's no way the workflow won't know where to start from. You could just throw your first task on there and start using it. So like you could just be like, hey, let me just list all agents in Halo, and that's my first task. That's fine. And then that can be your first task. The problem is that if for some reason you decided to create a loop back and say you want to loop over all agents until you find the right one or something like that, now the workflow goes, I don't know where to start, because it doesn't know which one is first. So best practice is that grab what's called a no-op or a noop task. No-op literally stands for no operation. It is an action that does nothing. You can just rename that to start here, essentially, or beginning, or flow control, or whatever it is you want to do. There should be one thing that starts on top, and then you reverse those arrows. This is nothing else comes back here. It always comes first, okay? That's recommendation number one when building your workflows. Recommendation number two is that if you have a workflow coming from a, never mind, I'm getting distracted into the actual building of workflows. We're going to put that on hold for a minute. That'll be next video. We'll talk about those recommendations. Let's move back into the general interface of the workflow. There's a lot of buttons up here. There's a lot of buttons up here. We already talked about the side, and we're just going to go through up on top here. So the first thing we have is the edit. This is just literally the name of the workflow. Not a big deal. The next thing that we have is to view the results of the workflow. You can click on there, and it'll take you to a page indicating the status. It's a new tab, so you won't lose your place. It'll indicate the status of the workflow and how many runs have happened and what state they ended in. Not a huge thing to cover right now. It's just know that it's there, and you'll see that page again. It'll be recognizable when we keep going up. The next button that you have is to add a trigger, okay? You can add multiple triggers to the same thing. So if we take a trigger and say trigger on a webhook coming in and say inbound webhook, and let's turn that on. Again, we're not going to build a workflow. I'm just showing you the UI and how that works. So don't get distracted by all these settings I'm jumping through right now, and I'm not explaining them. We will go back over them in another video. I'm just showing the interface, and I'm just going to hit submit right now. And what happens, notice I now have a inbound webhook trigger here. I can come back here and add an additional trigger, which was the point I was trying to get to. And I can say this is a form submission, right? So now I will have two triggers that exist. Oh, I need to select a form, collect data. Cool, I'm glad I created a form. And now you can see there's two triggers here, and you can go into each one, switch the context, and then modify the settings of that trigger, okay? Now, the last thing to know about before we actually move on from the trigger area is that when you're dealing with something like a form or a webhook or something like those, you will need a dynamically generated URL. Rewst will create a URL that will be used. If it's an inbound webhook, that is going to be the URL you post your data to. If it's a form submission, that is going to be the URL of the form itself that's going to be sent to people to fill out. Okay, so in this case, I'm in the inbound webhook context. I'm going to hit the gear again, and notice I have view webhook URL. I'm going to hit that button, and here's the URL that I'm going to send my payload to in order to fire off that webhook. Okay, the payload will get parsed into the body, and you'll be able to read it as request. Okay, so again, more of those details later in another video. I'm just showing you, in order to get to the URL of where the webhook is, it's going to be inside the trigger settings. All right, I'm going to delete this trigger. It's not something we need. I'm just going to get rid of it. And now we only have the form submitted trigger left, and I'm going to go into that. And if we look here, we have a form URL, and here are the direct full URLs. Each organization that will have access to a form will have its own separate contextual URL. The only thing that changes is going to be the organization ID after the form. So if you notice, there's an organizations, there's a GUID for the organizations, there's a form, and then there's a trigger GUID. This will always be the same. This will vary depending on which context you want, and that'll define the organization that gets run, which then defines what integration settings and or what variables get used when that form is being triggered. Okay, to grab the form itself, you click the URL, and we can just open it up in a new tab, and you'll see it's literally the form that we didn't actually save when we were building, but it is there, and that is the live URL to actually submit that form for real. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to go ahead and delete that trigger so we can clear up that UI. That'll cause the gear and the trigger itself to disappear, but we do have the add trigger button if you want to put them back. Okay. The next button on the left is the workflow variables. This configures the workflow in general. It's not quite properly named, I guess. You do configure the variables here: input configuration, output configuration. Variable is the standard variable, going back to what we talked about, the organizational variables. This is a locally scoped variable within a workflow, and it is a predefined set value that will not change, or at least not change at the time of triggering the workflow. Okay. Input configuration is going to be those variables that pop up when you run the workflow to say, hey, these are inputs that you need to fill in manually. Neither the variable configuration nor the input configurations are required when you're doing the form submission. The values of the fields from the form will be passed in automatically as variables for you to use and address those values. So you don't have to pre-do it. However, if you're designing a workflow, it is easier to put it in there so that it gets hit within the autocomplete. So you don't have to try to remember what it is every single time and flip back and forth between the forms. Okay. The last thing here is the output configuration, and whatever you set in here is going to be this is going to be the variable that gets passed out, and the value of what's in that variable that gets passed out of the workflow when it gets into either a finished state or when it's a sub workflow and it's going back to the parent. The data that goes here is going to be the output of whatever you put in here. So you can say output, and then the key output will exist, and the value of that key is going to be whatever you put in here. And this can be full on Jinja. Again, we can just do right now hello world, and it is full on Jinja string saying hello world, and now the output is hello world. But you can do a full Jinja templating setup here, and it will pass the entire thing into the output key value. You can also even do sub objects and so on and so forth, but that's way down the line. We're getting carried away, which is a tendency I have to do in case you didn't notice. The other buttons here are more for advanced things. We'll come back to them. These are ways for you to export the workflow or clone it. When you're cloning the workflow, you can clone it to a different organization, or you can clone it within your organization. And if you do it within your organization, what will happen is that it'll run what's called a shallow clone. It'll only clone the existing entity that you're in right now. So we're in a workflow, it'll only clone this workflow. If we had the trigger set up to the form and then we clone it to a different organization, what would happen is that Rewst would look at the workflow and say, oh, I'm going to a different organization. The organizational variables that we have, that we're using, the form that we're connected to, and the scripts and templates that we're utilizing as well don't exist in the organization we're copying it to. So it's going to collect all of the related elements into a single bundle and clone everything into the other organization, so as to ensure that that clone works properly. When we're in the same organization, the problem is if you create duplicates, it's like, oh, now you have a mess, and or it may not even work, or it may fail, or which one are we referencing? So to prevent that, it just clones. It's a shallow clone. It clones the single entity that you're in right now, and then you can go either fix it or change it or whatever. If you're doing it to a different organization, those things may not exist. So it collects all of them and sends it back. Sends the entire thing over as one. Edit is for more advanced things. Again, we won't go into it, but note that if you ever come in here and mess with things, you can break your entire workflow. So please just be careful. This is a validator, and this is how you test it, and this is how you publish it. So testing it is basically just run a test. It'll complete the operations. I can't test this right now because, again, our goal was not to create a workflow. It was just to understand the UI. But if you did test it, it would display the results of what was going on. I don't have an integration here that works, so we can't do anything. Publish actually saves your work and says, okay, the things that you've done to this workflow now exist. And then you come back to it, you won't lose your work. Okay. That is everything on the top bar. We are almost done with workflows. And when I say done, I mean only in terms of what the UI is and how to utilize it. Each one of these things I mentioned is called a task. You can go to the three dots, you can create a copy, you can copy to clipboard and then paste it later. So I can come back here and paste the task, which it wants on my clipboard. And you can paste that, right? So you have all that stuff. And then the last option, of course, is to delete those tasks, which I'm going to do to clean this up. All right. You have two areas of a task. You have got the task itself. This is what gets performed. And then you've got the transition of the task. What happens once the task is finished? So it's not a clearly delineated split. It kind of looks a little like, you know, whatever. It's not clearly delineated as two parts, but it is absolutely two parts. If you click on the top one, it tells you about the task. And you have options to configure that task. Okay. If you click on the bottom one, it tells you about the transition. And you have the ability to add multiple transitions that can create a different flow within the workflow. So you can say that if they have a blue car, then go down this path. If they have a red car, go down that path. If they have a yellow car, go down that path, right? Or whatever other condition you can come up with that's needed for you to check for, you can check for that condition and have it go down each of those paths. You can say something like, we need to run a command on anywhere where either A or B is true. You can make that a Jinja condition, custom condition, or you can just make the two conditions on two different transitions and have them run parallel to each other. So you can have it say like, listen, on success or on failure, we want it to come here. And then everywhere else, we're going to run here. So actually, let me undo that because I have a better way of doing this. On success, we're going to run this command. On a failure, we're going to run this command. And then always we're going to run this command, right? Now, these commands don't mean anything in its current form because I'm just picking random tasks. The bottom line is, though, let me just delete this transition up here. This is an example of how this may be useful. If you want to run something, if there's a success, run a different thing if there's a failure, and no matter what, always run a third thing, then this is how you would do it. And you can notice that the color of the arrows are green. It's going to take any path that is true. Okay, so if the success is true, it's going to take that path. If the failure is true, which both cannot be true at the same time, but for some reason it may be able to. If the failure is true, then it'll take this one, and this will be false, so it won't take this one. But no matter whether or not success or failure occurs, it will always take this path at the same time. Okay? There is a setting that we're going to pay attention to. I'm not going to go through all the stuff here, but the follow first, the transition mode is the most important part of this, because in order to have a proper workflow, you need to be able to build logical conditioning. And if you don't know how the transitions work, you can't do that. So this is why I'm covering those parts. There's a difference between follow all and follow first. It kind of has it explaining here. Every matching transition will be taken exactly like what we just described, or only the first matching transition will be taken. Let's say you don't want it to always run this. You only want it to run this if either of these have failed. If it didn't fail and it didn't succeed, which is like a catch-all, how do you not fail or succeed, right? It's a maybe. Then you want it to hit the always, but if it does fail or succeed, you don't want it hitting always. All you have to do is come back here and say follow first. And notice the arrows are now yellow. It's going to take the very first matching path. That's what I'm looking for. So if I had this up front, then this wouldn't matter. It's always going to run this, and it's never going to run success or failure. If it may succeed in times where failure also happens, and we may miss the failure, then we would want to arrange it like this. We'd want the failure in front, success next, and then always second. You'd want to order this in a way to go most specific to least specific, right? Because you want to make sure that it's only going to follow the first matching path. So you hit failure. If it's a failure, you don't want to run anything else. Something bad happened and you don't want to go further. So you stop at that. If it's not a failure and it's a success, you come here. If it didn't succeed either, then you have a catch-all. And that catch-all may just be to email you saying, hey, something went catastrophically wrong, and we don't know what it was. If you were to like copy Microsoft's error messages from back in the day. The specific conditions that exist on the transitions themselves will tell you what these are. That I just showed you the first three. The last one is custom Jinja. You can literally create any kind of Jinja expression that will validate as either true or false. If the expression validates as false, then it will not run. And if the expression validates as true, then it will run. So that can be something as simple as saying false or saying true, or even doing 1 = 1 or 1 = 3, right? 1 = 1 is true, 1 = 3 is not true. So that's custom conditions that will display that. Now, the last part about this I'm going to tell you is the custom label area up here, right? You want to make sure, especially if you're doing custom conditions with Jinja, you want to make sure that you have a label that makes sense, that people can remember the flow, so you can remember the flow, because I guarantee you, you're not going to remember it a month later. So you would just be like disabled, for example, and because the custom condition is set to false, nothing's ever going to run here. So that transition is technically disabled, and you can just literally go and attach all the tasks to that chain so that nothing runs, basically, because it's all disabled. And it's going to just sit here waiting until, I mean, it's not going to do anything because it's disabled. It's just going to stop here and the workflow is going to be finished. So the idea is that if you have tasks that you've built out, complicated Jinja variable set, a lot of things you spent configuring, and you don't know and or not ready yet to run that task, but you have tasks before that you want to run, then you can just move those tasks into the disabled area and then still run your the rest of the workflow. So that's that. That's basically all I wanted to show you regarding workflows. Other stuff you can just figure out and learn. It's basically, like I said, a lot of it's self-explanatory. It's meant to be easy. And that's it. That's workflows. So let's go to the last page within the automation area. So if we just go back to automation, let's go back home first and hit the automations. We'll see the last page we're in is results. And notice the icon is similar. I mentioned we would see that screen again. Here are the results, and we can see existing workflow executions. These are all workflow executions that have happened over time. And remember, if you remember the data retention setting on the organization under settings, then that would be how long the workflow settings are, the workflow retention is kept for. That's how long the retention is for the workflow logs. I'm having trouble speaking now, getting close to the end. And you can see how many tasks, what the current status was, and so on and so forth. You can drive into the actual execution, and you can see the steps that it took to make that happen. Here's the core no-op 2, a no-op 3, an HTTP request, a text message, another no-op, another no-op. And you can dig into it to see what happened. You have the input, you've got the result, and you've got the workflow execution itself. So if there's a state, you can see the contexts of what happened. So right here's start 0 execution ID. So you can see all the contexts that have happened throughout that task. And as you go through, you can see each one has a different set of state. The contexts keep getting added to each other in an array, so you can always drill down into that. The last part about the screen I'm going to show you is the Jinja Live Editor. Remember, we saw it under Tools. Clicking here will load the Jinja Live Editor up, and it will preload it with all of the context from that workflow run, so that you can do your troubleshooting directly off of the values from that workflow run. So you don't have to go find that data and throw it into a live editor and then figure out what you did wrong with your Jinja. That's it. That's it for automations. The last one is the dashboard. So we saw it a couple times. I'll just go through real quickly. You've got your overview of workflows that are running, successful, error, pending, or delayed. You've got your integrations that need attention. Notice I've got a bunch of them that don't have anything, right? Because I just added 2 of them so that these are not configured. Got the workflow activity. So you can see the same exact summary of what we just saw with the results. You see pending tasks. The time saved is going to be the most important thing, because it's going to be what shows, it's going to be how Rewst tracks the value it's providing to you. When you configure a workflow, when you add tasks to the workflow, either one of those areas, you can add in how much time that task is saving, or how much time it takes to run that task manually is really what it's asking for. So it's like, okay, you just added a user to a mailbox, or added a user to a group, sorry. How much time would it take for you to do that manually? Well, I'd have to find the password, I'd have to MFA, I'd have to log in, find the group, I'd have to find the user, I'd have to add it in, and then I'd have to go update a ticket. So overall, let's say about 15 minutes. And you put in 15 minutes for that task or for that workflow. Every time that workflow is run, it's going to track that it saved you 15 minutes. And it's going to multiply that by the number of times that workflow gets run, right? Especially if you bring in the fact that you can take a form, send it to the client, you can pre-fill, you can automatically have Rewst automatically send that form out to the client to say, hey, I see you have a ticket about adding a user to a group. Please fill in this form, select the user, select the group. The client does that, and then Rewst runs, automatically performs the action. Then Rewst will go update the ticket, say, hey, it's done. How do you feel about your service today? That we completely automated. Rate your technician on a level 1 to 10. Oh, your technician was an automated platform called Rewst, by the way, FYI, right? And then you no longer are working on that ticket. You've automated that ticket. So that's time saved. All the time managing the ticket, communicating with the client, stuff like that. That's all time saved. It goes into the time saved for the various tasks that's being done. And then you have a time tracker on Rewst telling you how much time and how many hours it saved you over the last day, 7 days, 1 month, 6 months, 12 months. And that's money. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoy this Rewst overview. It's, again, just the interface. Said it enough times. More videos will be coming out. Hit the button, like and subscribe, and I will be releasing more videos. Thank you.